Since the beginning of time, humans have been able to understand complex ideas through stories. Primitive humans sitting around campfires told stories about adventures, about going off to the seashore or up to the highest mountains. And because of what we learned, we were able to do the same and not just survive, but thrive under any type of condition. The human brain has this amygdala, which serves as a kind of experience simulator. When we hear stories, it's as if our brains have the same pattern as if they were really happening to us. That allows us to try on new experiences over and over again before we experience them in real life. A well-told story engages our audience and connects them to the content in a way that nothing else ever can. Research suggests that most PowerPoint presentations are forgotten moments after you walk out the door. But you will remember stories sometimes for the rest of your life. So what goes into good storytelling? I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking to you about some best practices. The best type of story for your audience is one that is about your audience. That's right, make it about them. Start by including them in the setup. Have you ever been angry? Like really angry? Have you ever been so angry you couldn't make words? You'll see them begin to nod and follow along with you because they're experiencing that. This is a way to invite them into your story and make it kind of about them. So the process goes, before you tell them your story and your stuff about you, you first connect it to stuff about them. You ask, does anyone out here have children? What does a little child do when you say, no, you can't have it in a grocery store? Right, that's right. That's right. What they'll do is they'll have a super massive, full-blown, complete child meltdown. They'll lie in the aisle, screaming, clenched fists. This process allows you to first make it about them as they remember their child about their story, and then you can go into your child about your story, and they're right there with you. Next point is, please don't be a hero of your own story. It's great to tell stories about you, and it's actually great to tell your stories about you. But one word of caution, don't be the hero of your own story. This has been really hard for me. I would begin to tell a story and realize that this story ends up looking like I'm bragging. But no one wants to be an egotist, a know-it-all. When we build ourselves up, they lose interest. Tell stories about yourself, but don't tell stories about when you were a hero. Tell stories about when you didn't know something or you didn't understand something. Self-deprecating stories can be fun and funny and memorable, and they allow you to get a laugh and to help people understand your message. Next point is, don't lie, but do clean up your stories. One of the conversations I get into a lot is about how absolutely truthful we need to be in a story. And here's my thinking. We are telling stories to help our audience, to educate them, and to elevate our audience, to help them live better lives, to inspire them to be better people. And sometimes, in order to be more clear or to make our point, we reorganize our stories. We clean them up a bit. We move things around because, after all, we aren't journalists and we aren't on trial. Many times, a story just has to be cleaned up to make our point better and to make it easier for our audiences to follow along. Now, are we lying? No, I would never advocate telling a lie. You don't want to tell people that you've been shot down over Vietnam. That's not the point. The point is that real-life stories are often messy and real-life stories are hard to follow. To tell that story better means making it clearer and easy to follow. Now, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but I think more than anything, we're doing our audience a favor by telling them a better story. Always try to include your audience in your story. Margaret starts her presentation with a question. She would say something like, "What is the first thing you notice when you walk into a patient's room?" And then she looks at everybody and she says, "Come on, we've all been nurses for a long time. What do you notice when you first walk into the room?" And at first a few people chime in and she says, "I always notice the bed rails, because if the bed rails are down, guess what?" And then she pauses. The audience begins to suggest things. And then she says, "That's right, the patient is at risk of falling." This is Margaret's style of speaking. And we've called it here in our company the call and response method. The speaker actively involves the audience at every stage of the story. They make it universal. They will say, "How many of you get angry while driving?" Or, "Does this make sense?" These questions can be rhetorical questions, or, like in Margaret's case, you can wait for a response. But by involving the audience at every step, you've made this presentation into something that they feel like they are a part of. And then as you move through your story, involve the audience as much as possible, and they will reward you with their undivided attention. You want to make sure that you connect to the content. We don't just tell stories to entertain. We tell stories to illustrate our points. You tell the story about being lost in the forest as a kid to demonstrate how it feels to be vulnerable. You tell the story of sitting at your bedside with your grandmother and grandfather as they get sicker and sicker as a way to discuss what caring and compassion looks like. Every time our stories serve as tools for the greater purpose of elevating and educating our audience. That said, it is often necessary to give your audience that overt connection. They may be wondering, how in the heck does this have anything to do with what we were just talking about? So once the story is done, step out of it and connect back to your content. Now, the reason I told you about the story is this, because that allows them then to take the point of your story and the story, put them together, and remember it for a long time. Let's talk about the level of detail in your presentation. One of the most difficult things that we ever have when telling stories is how much detail do we put in? You put in too much and your audience gets bored. Put in too little and your audience never experiences your story as if it were happening to them. So how do you strike the balance? The fact is, you don't need a ton of detail. You need the right details. So when talking to your audience, take them back to a time when you went camping. You would ask these 4 questions. What would they see if they were there? What would they hear? What would they smell? And what would they feel or touch? And then throw in a couple of those details when you're talking about it. So the campfire is crackling and spitting. The smell of smoke and the recent rain drifts over us, and we hear at the top of a pine tree the call of a raven. A couple of details like that is all it takes for us to be in your story as you tell it. You can also use mystery to build your tension. In one group, a nurse named Jason told his story, but he told it in the wrong order. He started with the conclusion. The conclusion was that he had been diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And then he shared with us his medical journey as he went from being a healthy young man to being in and out of hospitals as the doctors searched for his problems. It was a great story, but it was in the wrong order. We build interest in our story by creating a mystery. Rebuilt, Jason's story was much more compelling. A young man, an even healthy, athletic young man, drops to the ground unexpectedly. Doctors struggle to find a cause. Test after test after test. Hypotheses are tried and discarded. Treatments that look promising fail. Then, and only then, and almost accidentally, they tested him for Crohn's disease, and they were able to treat him. See, in popular media, when you tell the outcome before people have a chance to hear the rest of the story, it's called a spoiler alert. And it's not a lot of fun. Once you hear the outcome, then the rest of it is kind of you're not interested in hearing it. Don't do a spoiler alert. Set up your mystery and then tell the outcome at the end. Now, when we're talking about stories, I have to also mention mini stories. Not every story has to be a full-blown story with a beginning and a middle and an end. Many stories are really mini stories, just a couple of sentences long. You could say something like, "Did you have trouble filling out that form?" "I sure did. I was here for 2 months before Allison sat down with me, and she went through that form line by line. She was patient, she was thorough, and a task that I felt overwhelming suddenly became easy." See, I didn't have a will problem, I had a skill problem. That could be the whole thing. Many stories can be used in almost every paragraph to help your audience follow along. So don't think when we suggest using stories that everything needs to be Lawrence of Arabia. Some are short and still remarkably effective. Let's talk about closing your story. So, as I said, every story has a beginning and a middle and an end. But don't shortchange the audience by leaving off the end of the story. In one of our group classes, a lady named Karen talked about the problems that her baby had at birth. She said, instead of handing the baby to me, they whisked him away, and I was confused. The nurse told me, we have to do something right now, or your baby might not live. Now, Karen went on to describe the incredible hospital and the great staff and how important it is for us to continue funding their neonatal department. But when she sat down, we all had a big question. But frankly, we were afraid to ask it. And so I surveyed the class. I said, did Karen's story leave you with any questions? And they squirmed and they hesitated. And finally, I had to say it straight out. How many of you want to know what happened to Karen's baby? And every hand shot up. See, she told a great story. But without the close, we were all left hanging. Incidentally, the baby's fine. And actually, the baby is now a high school student. But the message here is make sure that you close your stories and don't leave the audience hanging. Let's talk about getting emotion into our stories. When you're trying to convince a group, people will say you need to connect with their hearts and their minds. Notice in that statement that hearts comes first. People think that they are logically driven, but the reality is they're emotionally driven. If we don't connect with them emotionally, they might agree with us, but deep down they aren't sold. That is, until we connect with them emotionally. A perfect way to get emotional is with a great story. Now, I've worked in healthcare for a long time, and we have so many deeply emotional stories. The patients who didn't make it, or miracles as that one did. And these stories are amazing. Kids, babies, parents, the care team, the physicians, we're surrounded by these amazing stories. Get emotional. Get the stories that connect us back to why we went into this for the first place. When we connect with the hearts as well as the minds, then we can make a difference. Great storytellers are also great story collectors. As you think of adding stories to your presentation, get in the habit of collecting stories. They're all around us all the time. Get a journal and write them down as you hear them or as you experience them. Great storytellers always seem to have a perfect story to connect back to the message. But that's not accidental. The great storytellers spend years being great story collectors. I have loved having this time with you. Let me know how it works out. Telling stories is, and always has been, the most precious way that we can connect as humans. Thank you for your time.